Welcome to the John Brown University Chapel podcast, recorded in the historic Cathedral of the Ozarks in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. This week's chapel message is by Dr. Michelle Satterlee, Assistant Professor of Psychology at JBU.
All right. Today, we're going to talk about the fifth window, as Frank mentioned. And this window focuses on the teachings of Jesus and the feeding of the multitudes. You'll see depicted here, it has a shield with hands, a lamp of learning and heart, and it particularly is kind of reflecting on the graduates and diplomas of 1934. In 1934, the Articles of Incorporation for John Brown College were amended, and the university was officially established. From a distance, one might have described this as the school that should never survive. In early days, the college charged no tuition, was established by a person with little formal education and relied heavily on donations, even through the Great Depression. From a human perspective, this might seem like a bad plan. But despite those challenges, the first class of JBU graduated in 1935, and many more would follow. This particular window for us is a celebration. It's a reminder that where God calls, God provides for his work, in his time, and in his ways. Thanks be to God. So have you ever had a moment when reality just seemed to shift right in front of your eyes? It's as if a fog lifts or a film clears. These experiences are hard to describe, but for me, it's as if like something I didn't even know was missing is suddenly clear. Like some truth is revealed, and often it captures me. It's maybe beautiful or meaningful or really significant. Several years ago, I was traveling through the Philippines. I was visiting some friends in a local church, and we went to a place that they would go every week. Every week, they would go to an area outside of Manila that's known as Smoky Mountain. If you're not familiar with Smoky Mountain, it's actually, for years, was kind of the trash dump for many countries in the world. It's this huge mountain outside of Manila, and they estimate that maybe 5,000 families live on Smoky Mountain. And 25,000 people scavenge there, finding things that they can sell or trade or things that they can make a living with. And so this church would send people every week, and they would visit the homes of people they knew where maybe someone was injured or sick or not able to work, and they would try to encourage them and just provide them with some basic necessities. And so I went along for the ride. As you can imagine, without really good language skills in that particular context, I was not very much help. So while everybody else handed out the real food, they gave me bags of candy that I could give to little kids who gathered around us. So I might have had the better job, but probably less important. As we pulled up in the vans, like people just started gathering because they wanted to greet people they knew, and they were just happy to see each other. And as the candy came out, then we got like this following, right, up and down the streets. And right away, there was this one little boy, and he had a red bandana. Like, I always remember him. He had this bandana and this huge grin. And when I first saw him, like, I gave him a couple of pieces of candy. And so as we moved our way up and down, like, different houses, I kept every once in a while feeling this tug, like, at the corner of my shirt or on my sleeve. And I never turned to give him my full attention, because out of the corner of my eye, I could see it was the same kid with this red bandana. And I thought, well, I want to make sure that everybody gets something, and then we'll see what's left. But his tugs, they grew more and more persistent. And so finally, I turned, and I gave him my full attention. And he stood and looked at me, and he stood in front of me with his shirt kind of tucked up like this. And inside, he opened it to reveal what he had. He had this large amount of clean, like carefully protected candy. And he must have seen the question on my face. So with one hand, he kind of held his shirt up, his little pouch, and with the other hand, he pointed at the hole in my bag. I was so ashamed. Like, here I was thinking he wanted an extra amount of candy, and really he's following behind me, carefully taking everything that I drop. and protecting it and gathering it, and he brings it to me. And so he gently kind of put his candy in the bag as I held it. And then as I held it up, he tied a corner in the edge of the bag so nothing else would fall out. And when I reached inside to give him another piece, he wagged his finger at me. And instead, he turned and he opened like his little baggy shorts pocket, and he pulled out like 2 warm, kind of semi-squished pieces of candy that I'd given him at the beginning. And he started to unwrap one, and then he looked up at me and he offered me the other. So we sat there on the edge of this dirty road, like with an open sewer, in a place that smelled like I'd never smelled anything before. And we chewed our candy. And something important came into focus. It revealed itself. And though I still struggle to name it precisely, I know this. In that moment, all goodness was a gift. And none of it was for me. I know this. Giving and receiving for that moment were like blurred together, one and the same. It was a moment of beauty and grace. And I remember having the thought that I was glimpsing something of what was meant to be. When I read the story at the beginning of John chapter 6, I think something similar might have been part of that moment. I have to wonder if, even if they didn't fully understand or appreciate it, I wonder if the crowd and the disciples were being given an opportunity to catch a shift, a revelation. And I want to believe that even if just for a moment it held them, perhaps they had a glimmer and maybe even the thought, this is what was meant to be. From a surface reading, it looks like incredibly bad planning. If you've ever traveled, especially with a group, you know it's an awful idea to wait too long to think about food, right? You don't wait until everyone's hungry to try to decide where you're going to eat, because it's just a terrible experience. Hungry, hangry travelers, terrible idea, right? And that's what we see in John chapter 6. We see a really hungry crowd. These people have followed Jesus out into the hills because of the miracles he's performed. They've seen the signs. These are people with expectations. John notes that this is Passover season, and for the Jewish people, Passover was both a celebration of the past and a hope for the future. Someone was coming who would lead them, who would provide for them, and they saw the signs. He must be the prophet. They were looking and hoping for a political savior who could meet their expectations. So they've come to follow to see if maybe more signs will appear. Now, even in Sunday school, didn't anything strike you as a little odd about the story of the feeding of the 5,000? I mean, come on. In a group of 5,000 plus women and children, they don't count. In a group of 5,000 plus women and children, do we really think that like this little boy is the best planner? That he's the best traveler, right? He's the one who hasn't eaten everything. My parents and grandparents would put me on a 45-minute flight from Oklahoma City to Kansas City every year. And before the attendants even arrived with the pretzels, I had eaten all the snacks that they sent with me, right? I have a hard time believing that this boy is the best traveler in the group. So there's several ways for us to consider this, and I'm going to encourage you to keep thinking about it at some point. But after weeks of imagining and reading, I can tell you what my conclusion is right now. However, you explain thousands of people in the hills at dinner time with nothing to eat, it is not flattering to humanity. Whether people had what they brought and they were protectively keeping it hidden for themselves or their loved ones, or whether they'd followed without making arrangements or there were shortages, any way you look at it, this is a really basic, familiar need. And they knew evening was coming. And no one was prepared to meet that need. Not the disciples, not anyone in the crowd. And this is the beginning of a great reveal. Apart from the resurrection of Christ, this is the only miracle that's described in all 4 Gospels. Scholars agree that John 6 is a focus, it's a hub for the entire book of John. And in this passage, John reveals the work of God through a narrative, which then he later explores in discourse and explanation. So here's humanity in a crowd full of need, expectation, hunger, and only Jesus can provide. John makes it clear all along that Jesus is in charge. He already knows what he's going to do. When he asks about available resources, it isn't so that he can figure out how to meet the need. That's not the plan. John introduces his gospel by pointing out that since the very beginning, the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and through him all things were made. Nothing about this situation is confusing for Jesus. He knows what they hunger for. In fact, he knows what the crowd is hungry for better than they do. He knows their need more deeply than they do. He knows what has drawn them out of their homes and their daily routines, and he knows that they are following because they are attracted to the signs, and not because they comprehend or they really love him. He knows. He knows their agendas and their expectations, and he knows that by the end of this meal, they will forcibly try to make him king. He knows exactly how far their blindness goes. Now, please hear me when I say, I have no doubt about Jesus' ability to multiply fish and bread. Every fish that swam, every grain that grew was his. All of it. He called into existence all of it in the first place, and everything that was good that was given to them was by his grace. Multiplication is not a problem for him. Jesus could manage that food supply in any way he chose. But the Word, the one who created all things, came to earth to bring more than fish and bread. In a crowd that size, I can imagine that many of them had gone without. I can imagine that survival was a daily struggle. There were no extras. I can also imagine there were others who felt totally unprepared and undeserving. As the evening approached, they may have recognized how empty-handed they were. Maybe they were even embarrassed. In a crowd that size, I can imagine there were many who didn't have and were hoping for something to come. But in a crowd that size, I also have to imagine, at least, that there were a fair number who had planned ahead, who had prepared and worked hard, and they maybe felt confident in their ability to take care of themselves or to take care of those they cared about in their circle. You know, I'm a psychologist, right? So I'm also wondering if these groups were aware of each other. How did they recognize the people who had and who didn't? How did they feel about the others? Were there any assumptions that they made? We don't have answers to all those questions, but we do know this. Before them stood the one who created all things and who came to earth to bring more than fish and bread. So Jesus, at this point in the narrative, says, have them sit down, and he takes the role of host among his creation. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did the same with the fish. When I read that part, my breath always catches a little bit. Are you starting to get a sense of what's happening here? Jesus, the Word, who was God and always with God, stands before this crowd of hungry people full of expectation and misunderstanding, and he thanks the Father for the provided broken bread. He gives thanks. He will be broken for them. He will be the provision for reconciliation and redemption. He will suffer at their very hands so that right relationship can be restored. And he is so in tune with the work of the Trinity that he thanks God for this provision. For his own broken body, the bread of eternal life. He knows he can meet needs that they don't even understand. And then he distributes to them even more than what they want. This is one of those moments that I want to see replayed in heaven. Like, I'm taking my number now because I'm sure there are a lot of people ahead of me. But this is my request. This is one I want to see. The one who created all things could multiply fish and bread any way he chose, no problem. But I have to wonder if maybe he's doing another work as well. What do you think it was like for them to realize at some point that as far as Jesus was concerned, they were all in the same group? His intent was to feed all of them, as in fact he'd been doing all along, however it was provided. He distributed and distributed. You have to wonder what it was like to be on the other side of the crowd from where Jesus began. What thoughts would have gone through your mind, or what was it like to be the first to receive? How confidently do you take what is offered? But Jesus distributed and distributed, and there was still more than enough. There was going to be enough for everyone. What was it like to begin to trust that? Wow, like to know with confidence and certainty. I wonder when some of them stopped feeling the need to protect or grab or hoard or edge their way in or take just a little bit for appearance's sake. I wonder when they started focusing less on their own choices or needs and enjoying and trusting in what God was providing. I wonder when they came to realize that the broken bread was not a limited commodity, and they were not competitors, no matter how much their neighbor needed or took. They would be fed fully, more than they wanted. I wonder at what point it started to feel like a great party, a celebration, a feast, in which every single one of them would be equally invited. I can't sit with this story and not wonder how I don't join the party sometimes. What might keep me from being in this celebration? If someone watched us as a crowd, would they know how big God's goodness is? Would they observe how generously we could extend and receive his grace? Or do we sometimes feel and maybe even behave as if God's grace is in short supply? As if there might not be enough to go around? We all know that we hunger for more than food. Love, meaning, belonging. Are we ever afraid that God might just run out and not have enough for us? Especially if someone else seems to get there first or maybe gets a little extra. I'd hate to think of us all feeling like we're standing in some kind of cosmic ration line, silently keeping track of who is where. Does it ever feel like God might miss us in the crowd, might just not see us or know our need? Or do we ever feel like we just don't deserve to come forward when it's our turn? Are we able to fully celebrate when God meets the needs of others? Do we see it and think, yes, he's got this, what a great God? Or is it possible that sometimes we're too busy comparing? Do we really believe that God's heart is to provide for all of his children? Or does it ever feel like we're caught up in maybe a survival of the fittest mentality? At some point, everyone on the hillside had to decide how gracious and powerful they thought Jesus really was. Could there be enough bread and enough life to go all the way around? That kind of trust, that kind of belief, that can be hard to hold when we're so deeply aware of the crowd and we know our own hunger. But you and I, we have even more evidence of how far Jesus would go. In great love and in great cost, we know what he provided for us. On that day, Jesus moved among them. He distributed, and he distributed, and he distributed, and he distributed, and he distributed. And all received more than they needed. I think Jesus gave us a glimpse of how it's supposed to be.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the John Brown University Chapel Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes or whatever platform you're listening on, and we'd love it if you would leave us a review.